Hello and welcome back to another new video. So in this video we are going to talk about how to create a new React app from basics. This video is targeted for beginners and we will be covering the basics of this, and we will be covering how to make the app, how to manage the state, and how to use the context API to transfer the state data from one component to other component. Basically avoid prop trailing. Okay, so let's get into it. So the first thing we are going to do is we're going to run this command from the PowerShell. In my case, I'm using Windows, so it's PowerShell. If you're using a Mac, so there's a terminal. So go to your folder, in my case, code folder, npx create react app, and after that, the name of the app which you want to give. Let's hit enter. All right, so the npx has finished doing the installation and pulling in the packages. Now that we have an app on our system, okay, let's get into the folder. Okay, so cd, and we have named it as e-commerce UI app ls. So it gives me all the structure, and I want to quickly open the VS Code here. So the short code is code code space dot, and this will open up the VS Code. Perfect. So we have it here. Now, first thing we want to look at is the README. The README will give us an idea about what all commands are available and where do we have to navigate our way from here. Okay, let me quickly jump into the package.json. It has a bunch of things here, but the main thing that we want to see here is scripts, which has this start, build, test, and check. We'll be basically majorly focusing on the start part of this. You can either open a terminal within the VS Code. So I'm going to go back here and say npm start. Okay, so it's running it. Now by default, it is going to run on port number 3000. So this is how it looks. Let's go to the source folder. In the source folder, we have the main file, which is app.js. This app.js is the starting component, the base component. So this index.js file is the main JavaScript file which creates the element and mounts the React application into the DOM. Now how it does it? It basically points to a root ID element. If you can see here, document.get element by ID root. So this points to an element, a DOM element, which has a ID root. Now where is that element, you might ask? So this is basically coming from index.html file, which is inside the public folder. Now if you open this index.html, we should be able to see on line number 31, as you can see here, we have a div id is equals to root. So this is where our whole application will be mounted in. So this is the element. Now let's go back from here. So it has created a root and it has mounted our app, which is coming from this source. Let's close the public folder. Let's go to app.js. Now this is the part where if you make any changes, it will automatically reflect there. Now there is a hot reloading which is enabled. Let me just show you right away. Let's say we have this edit. I'm gonna remove this and I'm gonna say we have made a change here, and if I save it, so the hot reloading kicks in and it automatically does the diffing and it immediately renders our changes. Okay, now that being done, now let's do one thing. Let us make use of the local state in the components. Now how we can do that is, let's say we have uh, let me just import that and show you. For that, let's make a new component inside it, new file. Let me just call it, let's say, nav.js, and let me also make another component. Let's call it button.js. You can also name it as JSX. That's up to you. JSX. Okay. So we have created two components here, nav and button. And now what we want to do is we want to have our React state here. let's say import react comma, and in the curly braces, let's say use state, use context from react. Once we have that, let's quickly go into our function application. This is our component inside it, and let's create the state. The cost of signed in, or let's name it is signed in, and set is signed in. Now the nomenclature here is, if you make a state with is signed in, let's say in a camel case, then the next set that you're doing has to start in a camel case only, but the is will have a capitalized I. And then use state. And is the user logged in by default? No, we'll keep it as false. H1 tag, which basically greets the user, and based on the state it says welcome user or welcome guest. So how we do it, we have to make the JavaScript conditions inside curly braces here, and we have to say, hey, if this variable is true, then ternary operator, say, before I do that, welcome space. Okay, now inside this, in the ternary operator, I'll say string of is signed in, welcome user. If it is not signed in, then welcome guest. Now let's quickly save it. Now let's go back here and say welcome guest. Since we are not logged in, so it will say welcome guest. We have already made two empty components, nav and button. Okay, so what we will do is, let me just put the nav for now in here, and here yet will give an error, of course. So we have to remember the hierarchy. Basically all the library imports have to be first, and after that the component imports, after that the image and css imports. Okay, so the hierarchy is important. If you're importing, let's say, a local module or versus a module from some library, so the library one takes precedence. It is to be imported before local components afterwards. Okay, let's import nav from nav. Okay, so we have opened our nav.js. Now what I want to show you is another thing, like it's one of the extension called simple react snippets, which you can install in the VS Code if you're using a VS Code. And basically what it does is it gives you a shorthand for, let's say you want to import React from React, or let's say you want to have import React state, use state, all that. So you can go through it. Okay, so let's say IMR. So import React from React. Perfect. So this should be the first thing we have to do. Now, once this is done, now let's say what do we want to do next? We want to create a component. Perfect. So this is exactly what we wanted. Now what are we naming it? Nav. Perfect. We want to import the button here. Now before we import the button, let's go into the button and let's do the same thing. IMR, which imports React from React. Now the next thing is SFC, which is state function component. Let's call it button, and export default button. Perfect. Now this is done. Now what this will do is this will return us a button just like this. And in the button I'll say, hey, click me. Okay, now this has to be imported inside our nav.js. Okay, so we're not using it here. Okay, let's do one thing. Let's add the button here, and let's say button. The better way is we just close it here like that, because we don't need to put anything inside it. Okay, so the button is there. So it is there. But right now the button does nothing. I'm just clicking on it, it does nothing. Okay, so what we can do is let's quickly go back to the button and let's say button on click. And what does on click take? It takes this and it takes anonymous function, and in the anonymous function we can return and we can say um console dot log button is clicked. Okay, now I'll quickly look at this and click, button is clicked. How many times? 10 times. Perfect. So this is also done. Okay, but this is not the only thing that we want to do. What we want to do here is we have managed, we have a local state here in the app, but this is only native to the app.js. Now it has a child called nav.js. Now if the person is logged in, we need to send the data from app to nav as a prop, and then from nav to, let's say, to the button. Let's say this is a login button and that it has to say log out afterwards. Okay, let's say this is login, and after that, if the person is logged in, then it has to say log out. Now one way is to do the prop drilling from app to nav and nav to button. One, we can do that. The second way is we can use something called as context API. So what context API does is basically it provides you a place and a reference to that place. Now how we can use that? Now let's say we have use context. I've taken here by mistake. We have to use a create context. Okay. So when we take this create context in this place, just before this, we have to make a context like a login context or auth context, something like the variable, which is like on a global level and which can be accessed throughout the application. How we do that is export const, and after that, let's say, let's call it auth context is equals to create context. Simple, just like that. This logo is not used. Let me just remove that. Okay. So this auth context is created. Now what we need to do is we need to pass this context as a wrapper so that the whole application has access to it. Now that the only context this has, auth context has been created, but it has not been passed on to the application. So how we do that? So there's a thing called as provider. So what we can do is we can say, hey, this auth context dot provider, and it has to get a value inside it. So that value is going to be our these two variables which we have in the state, and it has to end as well, definitely. And let's end it here and let's get rid of the empty space. Okay, so now we are going to pass the values that we already have here in the state. So is signed in and set is signed in. So basically one of them is a variable with a value, the other one is a callback function, which basically is going to go back and update the state. So we have it here. So this has been passed. Now we don't need to show that in the navigation because navigation need not know this. Only the button need to have the data with it. So how we can access that in the button? So let's go back here and let's import the use context here. Okay, use context. So now we are also going to need to import the variable that we created in the app.js, which is our auth context. So how do we do that? Import of auth context from app. I think that should be fine. We don't need to give the .js. Okay, now that we have that, now we need to extract the value out of it. Now what is the value that we have given here? We have given is signed in and set is signed. Let's actually copy this from here. Let me just copy that and let me go back here. Let me create this like this is equals to, now what is this? Use context. Which context we want to use? We want to use the auth context. Okay, so if it is signed, if the person is signed in, then what we want to do is if signed in, then say logout. Otherwise, say login. Let me just break it down to this line, and let me just close it here. And this is going to be a string, 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 string. And let's put this down as well. Now, since I have not given it any value, it is going to remain like this. But what if we can change it? How we can change it? So since we already have added this here, login is not defined, my dear. Yeah, okay, cool. So on click of this, let's call back this set sign in, and then let us send the inverted boolean value of the sign in, which means if it is true, set as false. If it's false, set as true. That's it. Now this, when I click on this, will set the state value which is in here, and from here it will set the value within the auth context, and then it will simply subscribe to it and get the value. Okay, let's test it out. Simple. It says logout. Now again, as you can see, welcome user, welcome. So it's a very simple and a very basic example how you can use state and use context within the application. One thing to keep in mind here is, as and when the complexity increases of your application, you need to consider moving to other state management solutions. You might want to consider maybe using Mobex or Redux, which is the industry standard. Most of the companies, they prefer to use Redux. Flux is also another option which you can also, it's good to learn. So that's it for this video, guys. I hope you have learned something. Please like the video if you have liked the content, and please subscribe to the channel for more content. Okay, see you next time. Bye bye.